Now I'd like to welcome to the floor to commence the case for negative team, the first speaker, Harold.
Mr. Speaker, it was curious for an affirmative team that wanted to place so many stringent conditions upon their model that were contingent upon the cooperation of the government in that country, that they just weren't happy to fund and put capital investment into the government rather than endorsing a fire sale of that government's sovereignty. We think that that is a problem and not something that we should allow. Governments that even they had to cooperate with in order to enforce all of the conditions of their model. If that is the case, that we can cooperate with these governments, why is it the case that we should continue to undermine their legitimacy and undermine their sovereignty by fundamentally not funding them, but just allowing corporations to take over swathes of their land? I'm going to look at three main issues in rebuttal. Firstly, the conditions of this model. Secondly, sovereignty. And thirdly, who and what countries are going to take these deals. Firstly, on these conditions, as I flagged, we think that if you need to cooperate with the government in order to trade with them in expertise, in order to get enforcement on labour standards, that you can trust that government to deal with the type of capital investment and foreign direct investment that the negative team is going to be supporting in today's debate. But secondly, let's look at the enforcement that they wanted to talk about. They said that there would be accountability because these corporations would want to keep their workers happy. We don't think that that will actually extend to the type of long-term development that they wanted to assert will occur in today's debate. When your boss, Mr. Speaker, is your government, and that government has only a profit incentive in that region, we think that you don't get the type of long-term development that a state could provide. But secondly, the other form of enforcement was like military intervention. The people that they wanted to talk about, like Chinese corporations, do you actually think that countries like Uganda or Sudan are going to go in and try and enforce standards upon a Chinese corporation and incur the wrath of China? That is never going to happen in today's debate. Their most forceful type of enforcement was never going to come to fruition. Let's look at sovereignty then. The first thing that they told us is we can sell this because this land is of no inherent use or benefit. We have three responses to this. The first is that they said in order to make this land useful, they would have to do things like irrigate water from other parts of the country. Clearly that shows that this land, or the use of that land, is going to have an impact on other parts of the country. Secondly, to the extent that this is just useless land, what type of profit is this country going to get from selling it? Because we don't think that those corporations are going to value it very highly. But thirdly, if it was the case that it was valuable to that corporation but not to the country because of an expertise gap, we think that we can provide expertise to that country in the form of foreign direct investment and capital, and we don't need to take their land in order to provide that. The second issue on sovereignty was that they said that the state can sell it because it is the state's land. That is not true, Mr. Speaker. The state possesses sovereignty so that its people can choose what to do with it. The sovereignty derives from the people and not the state. So they said they'd have a referendum, but they also said that they would override the will of that referendum if it was not in line with what the state wanted. So it really wasn't a referendum at all. But then they also wanted to go on and say that these are countries that are mainly divided on tribal loyalty. Two responses. Firstly, it is bizarre then that you are functionally allowing the last decision to be made by the state that you've already said that a lot of the majority of that population disagrees with on a tribal basis. But secondly, we think that they just enforce the idea that the state is powerless and useless in these countries, and that undermines the long-term development of that state and government. Thirdly, in rebuttal, let's look at, and this is kind of also the premise of our case, let's look at the type of countries that are going to be taking this deal. We think, firstly, the types of countries that need development the most are not going to attract this type of entrepreneur investment. Why is that? Because sovereign risk still exists, irrespective of the conditions that they wanted to impose. So in 2002, when we saw that North Korea sold part of their land near the Yanglu to the Chinese tycoon Yang Bing, we saw that he had to pull out because of the reconfiscation of old currency in North Korea in 2009. Those sovereign risks still exist, and entrepreneurs do not want to enter the countries that have the most need for this development. But then they wanted to say this would occur in functional democracies and we wouldn't have these sorts of problems. If it is the case that we can trust these governments, if it is the case they are functional democracies, we should be able to invest in those countries at a government level and not steal their land. That's what we saw being effective in Africa, where we've seen in Equatorial Guinea, for instance, because of capital investment from the West, they have a 66% average ingrowth in their real GDP. We think that that type of capital investment into the government is the most effective form of development in these regions. So let's look at my substantive. We think firstly that fire sales of sovereignty in this way damage the state. That is because that this proposal says the developing governments that take this up cannot be trusted to ensure the development of their country. We think that that's harmful for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it increases the idea of the sovereign risk existing if you want to invest in the other parts of the country that haven't been sold off, because you have said that that country cannot account for their own development. So we think that the idea that they are unstable and that sovereign risk exists is increased in the other parts of the country that would also require investment. The problem with that is that it also removes the ability of FDI and loans to be given from international actors, which currently enforce the type of conditions of democratisation and development that people have to adhere to in order to get that money. We think that's a really important way of engaging with those states, when we can say, we will give you this money if you adhere to those conditions, and that's an ongoing way that we can negotiate with those states. We think that's mutually exclusive, because these groups are not going to do it if they're just selling off swathes of land to corporations. We don't think that the impetus for FDI and capital investment remains under this proposal. But also, we would say that corporations under this proposal have no interest in the sovereignty of the rest of the country and the development of the rest of the country outside of their autonomous region. We think that that's a problem, because what we've seen is that those groups will get worse, and we think that they should be a priority in today's debate. Furthermore, increasing a standard of living is a very simplistic test of development. We think that what we need to be actually prioritising is political development and educational development and infrastructural development that only the state can provide. Because if this development happens under their proposal, it is premised on the absence of a state in that region, and we think that that is problematic. So why is it the case that we are happy to prioritise the people in the rest of the country and not allow them to be left behind? The first is because the reason why we would prioritise short-term increases in an individual's profit is so that we would allow them to be empowered in a state and to question that state and to gain material benefit from a state in the future. But these people are existing without a state and will not question that state or seek to develop that state in the future. But furthermore, we think that these people that are left behind are going to be the majority of people in today's debate, and that their development needs to be prioritised, not least because where we have seen development being radically outpaced in different areas, we see distinct social resentment between those groups, and the country has selected a certain area of land to be a ticket out of poverty, increases the resentment between those groups. But finally, I'm going to tell you why this isn't actually a ticket out of poverty, because we don't think that it is effective. We think firstly that there's going to be a race to the bottom, because there is competition, as they attempted to insert. If there is competition between these corporations, that they are just going to employ only minimum standards of development and not actually long-term development standards. We think that they're not going to blame the government about why they weren't able to enact those standards, but rather they're going to blame the market and say that we have to enact a profit, that's why we only have minimum standards. But also, we think that they also have absolutely no interest in intergenerational profit. So when these guys wanted to say that they would only enact this at a 99-year lease, we think that impetus is to exploit that land, exploit those resources to the extent that you can then wind back that investment once you've totally destroyed that land. For the reasons that we don't think that this is a ticket out of development, but moreover, we think that it undermines the most important form of development, which is development of the state, we're very, very proud to oppose.